Okay, great. So hello again to everybody. I'm really glad to be sitting here today with Peter Koenig, who I've gotten to know better and better over the last, I guess, 2 years now. It feels quite long, but it's actually, been a fairly short amount of time. And so before I let you say a little bit more about yourself, I just want to quickly frame, why are we here today and why did I choose to invite Peter to talk about this topic? So I'm one of those people who's been working for, most of my career in very decentralized, participatory, collaborative networks and organizations. And in Greater Than, which is a collective that I'm a partner of, we're really dedicated to new ways of organizing and how we can make that more common in the world. And these new organizing specifically around self-management, participatory practices, and how to have more distributed leadership and power. And so over the last years of doing this work, the topic of leadership, it just keeps coming up as something that just feels really challenging and like something where everyone I'm working with is sort of out of their comfort zone and not actually sure what type of leadership do we want to see more of. And if we're in a self-managed context, what is the right type of leadership in this context? And so I stumbled upon Peter's work around Source a couple of years ago, and it really, just brought up a lot of aha moments and a lot of resonance to describe certain things that I was feeling and seeing. But it also felt like there's many elements that just seem to really be challenging for people in my field, let's say, to really be okay with or to even entertain as an idea around the concept of source. So that's why I've just gotten really fascinated by how actually these source principles that I really think are extremely valuable, how we can actually make them work in the context of organizations that want to have less traditional hierarchical structures and power dynamics. And I think it's quite essential, really. So I invited Peter today for us to sort of build on past conversations and to just, see where we can go with this, to learn a little bit more about what's needed for this to work in that context. So I think before I go any further, maybe just handing it to you, Peter, to say a little bit about yourself and your journey that you think would be useful to share on this topic. And then we can maybe go a little bit into the source principles briefly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and hello to everybody. And it's wonderful to see such a large participation here and some familiar faces as well. So hello from my side, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and particularly with you, Fran, doing the interviewing. And maybe I'll just start there, because you're not just doing the interviewing, but you are actually the source of all of us being here right now. So, we're going to be manifesting these source principles, I hope. In fact, we already are in this next hour. So it's not just about talk about source. I think we'll be actually doing it. So how it looks is that I will be following your guidance, because I don't know what needs to happen here, but you will, or you do. So so what do you want me to do next?
So I guess I would love to just hear in a few sentences for people that maybe are coming here today and actually don't know much about you, to just understand a little bit of the context of your knowledge and where that comes from, and how you ended up working on Source.
Yeah. So thank you. So I've got, I'm quite old now. I'm 74. I've got white hair and everything. But actually, I was in my 30s. I was working for one of the largest American multinational companies. It was called Litton Industries, looking after their real estate, and in very conventional business, dealing with very conventional management. I went to business school. I was making good money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I had a kind of epiphany. I didn't have any problems. Many people who have epiphanies seem to have problems. I was very fortunate. I didn't have any problems. I was just curious and put myself into early stage workshops, had a sort of epiphany and discovered love and decided that that my purpose was to bring love into the business world. And this was when I was around 37. And I decided at that time that I would stop doing anything that I didn't want to be doing. So I've been living my life doing what I want to do. And what I've done in that period, in the context of creating love in business, is create two main, we can call them tools. The first one is what I call money work, which helps people to look at their relationship to money and change it if they want to change it. And the second one, which started in 2009, was the Sourcework, which just describes, it's just a description of what we all do when we manifest anything. And when we manifest anything, a project, an enterprise, an initiative with other people. So as our friend, Tom and my friend described, Charlie Davis, he once put it this way: Sourcework just describes what works when work works. And that's just what it's about. So it's about actually doing what you love, loving what you do, and the organization around that. And in the context of the business world, it's about, for me, creating love in business. So that would be my summary. So I was born in England, I'm English, but I've lived in Zurich in Switzerland, which is where I'm talking from, for 43 years now. And I have a partner, Barbara, who used to run vision processes and still does. And we've been together for 29 years. So we have a little bit of experience in relationships as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe just to add a little bit of context on how we know each other, because I think it's always nice to sort of tell a bit of a story around that, which is that actually, so Tom Nixon, who's also here right now, he's really the person that introduced us to Peter's work. My colleague, Kate Beecroft, and I, we sort of got in touch with him a while back. Hey, Tom. To learn how to play a money game, which is a really great process to start working on your personal relationship to money. And from that, we sort of decided a few years later that we really wanted to go deep with Peter into his source work. And we organized a retreat in New Zealand with the Inspiral Network, a network that I'm part of. And so this was actually right before the whole lockdowns and everything started happening, really, but quite closely before. So we had a whole week together, and it was really interesting for me. Being here today is really trying to pick up a bit from where we left off there, because being with many people from Inspiral who were very focused on how do we share leadership, how do we distribute power, and discussing about the source principles, it just brought up so many juicy and controversial topics. And so one of the things I really want to do today is to sort of come back to that and see, like, okay, a year and a half later, what are our insights about this? And so before we dive into that, I want to sort of give a little bit of basics for people that maybe are not familiar with the source principles yet. So I know, Peter, that it's hard to do this very quickly, but I was wondering if you could just briefly elaborate on sort of the most important source principles, so that people have a sense of that. And I'm also just going to share in the chat 2 links for more resources about this if you want to go deeper into that sort of basic understanding.
Great, very gladly do that. So, you know, Tom is just, I'm sure one of the resources, yes, is Tom's book, Work with Source, which is just out recently. And I'd like to say that what I've done is just create a groundwork. First of all, in terms of relationship with money, and now with relationship to source, the source work, I see my job as from scratch, creating kind of groundwork on which people can build. So Tom has built out in his book, his version of source work based on mine. And there's another book which was out just before Tom's called Little Red Book on Source from Stefan Merkelbach, and it's a different book. But this is actually my vision, that anybody and all of you listening here, when you understand the source principles, you will interpret and build on them in your own way. So what do they involve? So this is my description of them in short. it involves three aspects really of organization, of how to organize. The first aspect is the order. There is always an order in everything. In nature, there's an order, and the way we work together has a particular order. Now, there was one particular order, way of ordering, which was running for more than 300 years and still runs, which is a linear order for science and technology and to create material products, and has been extremely successful. But it doesn't tell us how to collaborate together when we want to do something creatively. So when we're all creators and think we're sort of more or less equal partners, how do we actually collaborate? And the source principles describe there is a natural order. Actually, it's related to time in a sense, which must be followed. And if you don't follow this particular order, you're likely to create disorientation and collaboration. So there's a description of how we order ourselves from scratch when a new initiative is started. So that's the first thing. The second thing is actually about the second theme, major theme is collaboration. And so these things, they run into each other. And the third major theme is succession. So if you look at what's happening in initiatives and projects and enterprises, there's very little, far too little, in my view, attention being paid to succession processes. Now, I'm talking about not just succession processes of a whole enterprise. When one founder leaves, what does he do so that the thing keeps thriving? But also within enterprises, when somebody leaves the role, leaves an organization, leaves an enterprise, the normal way is put an ad in the newspaper and write out a job description and do some recruiting. Well, that worked for the material production line, but it doesn't work very well for the new kinds of enterprises that we're actually dealing with now. So those are the three sort of headlines for me. And if we come to the actual principles, we start at the beginning, and the beginning is one of the controversial things, as you will recall, Francesca, which is that every enterprise, every project and initiative has one person who actually sourced it. Now this upsets very often some people because they think we are co-founders and we all did it together. But when you narrow it down to look at how anything started, you can actually see that it is one person, and this is related to the order. So this is the first, let's say the founding source principle of the source principles, which is extremely important. If you want to figure out what's going on in any enterprise organization, to figure out who that person is. It doesn't matter how small or even how large the enterprise is. I'm sure Tom will agree, we can look at we can look up, and probably you yourself, Fran, look up in Google mammoth enterprises, and we don't have to look up very long to figure out actually who's really is calling the shots when A comes to B. Who is really the figure that everybody's looking at to know the next direction the enterprise is going to take. So that's I stop there at that point.
Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if there's any people here that haven't heard these yet. In I guess a lot of the groups that I work in, just introducing that principle can lead to a lot of pushback or upset, or just be something that is rejected quite strongly, the idea that there is one source. And I think there's another one actually, Peter, that you often mentioned that I think we did debate a lot about in New Zealand, which was that the source is fully responsible for everything that happens.
Yes.
And I think that you have a way of saying that I think makes it extremely hard for many of us to be like, yep, definitely, because we're trying to distribute responsibility, right? And that's the whole point, that more people are carrying the load together and that it's not just one person.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You have to understand something about paradox here. So in order for everybody to find their place in an initiative fully 100% and be 100% responsible for the role that they are playing, you have to accept that the founder, to start off with, is 100% responsible for having created something out of nothing. And because they have created something which didn't exist before, there's nobody else that can actually be responsible for it. So it's like there's something fundamentally realistic about that. You know, if you create something, you have to take responsibility for it. It doesn't matter how small or how big it is. And this is actually a very effective working principle. And if you look at the attempts to share that responsibility, and there have been a lot in past years, and I think they're getting to see what I'm about to say, to try and share that founding responsibility, which I say is the sources, creates enormous problems. It creates power struggles, actually. Whereas, and this is the paradox, when I am source of my community, organization, enterprise, initiative, ecosystem, whatever you'd like to see, I like to call it ecosystem now. You know, there are people coming into my, let's call it ecosystem or community, who take responsibility, and I want them to take 100% responsibility for their role that they're playing, because I don't know how to, I can't take that responsibility, but I can take responsibility for what I call the field in which they're operating. And that's my responsibility. But I can't take responsibility for their role, because they know best what's to be done, and I don't know that. So that's the paradox, if you like. Where we are all equal is that we all have the ability to be sources. We are all sources. And we can all be, if you like, the founding source. We can all create something out of nothing if we choose to. But if we choose to take our energy and put it into somebody else's field, as what I think Tom refers to as specific source, I call it subsource, and many people don't like that because they don't like to be called a sub anything. I don't mind it myself. I'm happy to be a subsource. But if I choose to put myself in somebody's field to realize my things, then I look to them to give me direction, because for what needs to happen in their field. And that's what really works well when there's no ego attachment to being number 1, number 2, or number 25, because everybody's realizing themselves.
So it's interesting that you're mentioning the subsource topic, because it was actually one thing I was curious about, because I think one of the main challenges that I've encountered is really around language. And I guess the reason why I'm also here wanting to talk about this is that I feel like I understand the essence, and I feel like it's so valuable and important, but that somehow the package, the way we're talking about it, it needs to be adapted a bit more to the space that I'm working in. That's my impression, because somehow waiting for people to just actually change their mind completely, it feels like it's too hard. And actually the term subsource is one of them that definitely always brings up a lot of feelings. And the other thing that is quite interesting is that you always say, Peter, that we're all sources and that we all just need to acknowledge ourselves in our ability to source things. But that somehow I feel like in how this is then translated and how people understand it, that gets lost. It's really something that I've observed often, that even if you sort of emphasize that in a group, that if you're, calling one person the source, that doesn't mean that everyone else cannot also be a source.
No, of course not. We want everybody to be a source, but I'm referring here to the order, to following the order. And, I use another word which people don't like, hierarchy, which in its original meaning, etymology, means sacred order. And so, you know, I do use these maybe provocative terms, and I'm still very happy to do it. Tom is very much better at me at the sort of diplomacy you're talking about, and makes things much smoother. And I think Stefan does too. But I have no difficulty with being a bit provocative here, because what's happening if people get triggered? They're being triggered by their own reactions to their own experience in hierarchical organizations, where actually what's happened is that the power has been misused. And if they're triggered, it's a sign that they are themselves misusing power. So I think the trigger that they are experiencing is actually good. It's good for them to have that reaction, because otherwise they might put a nice little varnish on source principles and actually still be acting out of that same old model. And if they are triggered, they can do some inner work on themselves. So I want everybody to enjoy being subsources and enjoy hierarchy and do all the inner work, because otherwise they won't properly represent the source principles. So I'm challenging you a little bit on that now.
Well, humor me. What if we tried to come up with some other terms? Would you be open to that?
Well, Stefan Merkelbach talks about specific source, and I have no objections, of course. No objection, I mean, rather than subsource. Okay.
Yeah. So one hypothesis that I've been entertaining is that I guess many of the groups that I'm in, there's sort of a chronic not sufficiently acknowledging the source, right? Like often there's sort of a history of from the start of a collective or a network that whoever actually started it, since there was no language, no really even awareness that was happening, that there's really like, a real huge lack of acknowledgement. So it feels like having this terminology really helps, and it's sort of like a relief of like, now we can finally name this thing that's been really ignored. But I think that then sometimes leads to the other extreme, which is that basically everyone else who's not the source, suddenly it's like, well, what am I, right? And if then what am I is, well, you're a subsource, somehow that just, it seems difficult. And this is connected to another thing that has been happening in a lot of the networks I'm in, which is that somehow there's a lack of, I guess, roles that are more like conceptual roles that are not like, oh, you're specifically holding a certain project, but that if I think about, so the WeShare is an interesting example. This is a network I'm part of. And there's historically been huge amounts of fights about the term co-founder and who can call themselves co-founder. And I really see it as a symptom of there not really being any other named roles that people can have. So it's like either you're a co-founder or like you have no role, right? And that somehow there's not enough there. So I guess part of me is just wondering, like, do we need to also direct some attention towards everyone else and think more creatively about what are names and words to describe what they are doing as well, so that we can sort of fully acknowledge what the source of the whole is doing and also what everyone else is. That's just some current thinking and some hypotheses. I'm curious what you think, Peter.
I'm not sure I'm open. I'm open to anything which will improve, which will evolve, improve, and develop. So if you have come up with some idea that does that, I'm all for it. But I'm not sure that if you look at WeShare as an example, I'm not sure that will resolve the situation, because the real problem with the situation, and I was at the fest and I had a good exchange with the source there. The real problem was that the source allowed himself to be booted out of his own initiative. So it's like where there's a weakness in source, you're not going to be able to resolve it by just producing some other names and hoping.
Yeah. I totally agree with you that it doesn't solve that problem for sure. It's a different problem space, let's say. But yeah, I guess one thing that I'm curious about is, so as I mentioned, we had this retreat 2 years ago with some Inspiral people. And one of the main things is that a guy called Joshua Weil, who many would call the source of Inspiral, or who definitely acknowledged himself as the source of the beginning of Inspiral. We had a lot of debates and reflections throughout that week. And I think one of the hypotheses was the beginning of a new initiative seems to have a certain pattern, and that like everyone sort of adhered to, yeah, we can see that, how like the source is there at the beginning and there's a certain role. And then basically there's this idea that at some point that person sort of does a succession basically of the source, but to a group and not to one person. And, you know, there was a lot of debate about that, but I guess not to sort of fully go back into it, I was just curious, Peter, if you had any, additional insights from that time over the last year. Because I remember you shared some really interesting things about, I guess, sort of like a holding back of power that was happening in the group, that everyone was sort of holding back and not feeling like they could really step in. And I found that really insightful and interesting. And so, yeah, I was just curious.
So actually, to tell you the truth, Francesca, I'm just curious what's happening there now. I haven't had any new insights, but you know, the main thing which I was sharing there and still share is that when the succession takes place, it needs to take place from one hand to one hand. And if it's purported to be handed over to a group, it hasn't actually been handed over at all. So there's a sort of pretense at handing over which actually hasn't taken place. And if at that point the source sort of backs off, what you have is the source is not taking their place. And systemically, nobody who's in that field will have the feeling that they can find their place. And this is actually what happened. I mean, you were part of it, and other people were part of it. And I remember, you know, you're all very potentially, I mean, you were all very powerful in your normal roles and working with large organizations and stuff. And I remember one of you saying, and I won't mention who it was, said, you know, I can't believe what's happening here. We're all these powerful people, and in this environment here, none of us are really expressing our power. None of us are finding our place. And that was my conclusion. Well, of course you can't find your place. If the source is not taking his or her place, then nobody can take his or her place. And unfortunately, this is far too common, and particularly in activist kind of organizations and initiatives. And it's a kind of reverse of what's happening in, let's call it, normal old style business organizations. It's the other side of the same coin, where you have this hierarchical boss who wants to have power over everybody and control and have secure the position, his position or her position, so they have control over it. So this is just the other side of the same coin, and it hasn't, in my view, transcended. So what we need is a transcendence from this state of one side of the coin or the other side of the coin. And this is really, when source principles are understood, this is actually what happens. This is actually what we're doing. We're transcending and creating a new, you could say, a different kind of culture where power, I want to see everybody in my organization, in my system, in my ecosystem, have full power. I don't want to have power over anybody. I want everybody to have full power. And as source, that's what I see my job is, to manage my field so that people are in their full power of loving what they're doing. It's not about controlling or anything. And it's a totally different system. It's a totally different culture. So this is really what the source work is about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the reason I also was mentioning is in Spiral is that I think this observation about people holding back power really is a pattern from, the whole like NGO activist scene, that I think we're seeing that in so many places. And it's something I've been running into quite a lot in my work also in the last few years.
Yeah.
So one interesting situation that I'd like to share is that there's a couple different organizations I've been working with that, you know, want to become self-managed or more decentralized. Often they're also working in the crypto space. And it's really interesting because there you encounter such a rejection of leadership. And going down to sort of the detail of if you're sort of setting up teams or circles, and we say, okay, so each circle is going to have one person that, for instance, in Holdocracy, that would be the lead link, right? Like the person that's accountable to just make sure there's a bridge to the rest, or that's sort of leading that circle. In most groups, they refuse, or like you need to create roles and each person can just have one role. It's sort of a general guideline we give. But most of the time, it's just, it's not actually possible. People say, no, it has to be 2, it has to be 3. And I find it really fascinating, just this small detail, the amount of resistance that I'm seeing in many different contexts. And it's just leaving me a bit like, what could we do? So I don't know, Peter, if you have any examples also of organizations that you've seen have maybe gone through that or found ways to, found their way to resolve this.
Well, you know, let me explain something. The first thing we do when we do Sourcework, and Tom is another great resource, but you're a great resource for this yourself, is to look at who the source is, and the core people around the source, and to look at, with the lens of source principles, one can see why I said it, when things are working well, source principles are being used. So if things are stuck somewhere, you can actually see pretty quickly, you can diagnose why. So that's the first part. And that's the easy part. The next part is the more difficult, because to make a change, to make correction, you're going to have to change something. And that's when the resistance comes up, as you're talking about. And that's where what I call the money work, my money work, comes in. It's actually not so much about the relationship to money. It's about people's relationship to their role and identity. And the tool I've developed is, as you know, it's quite a quick working tool. And that's what at least I and the people that have been trained by me usually apply, or try to apply amongst the other tools that they have, to be able to defuse the resistance as quickly as possible. So that's the work. That's how we go about the work. But it's not, we're dealing with a complex system. So the thing doesn't necessarily transform from one day to the next. I'm thinking, for example, of a handicapped school I worked with here in Switzerland, where I didn't have to do much work, but I accompanied the source and the CEO, who was actually the two, but formally the number 1. but they both recognized their positions, and I worked with both of them, and it was a process of a year to 2 years. They did it step by step, because the source didn't have a formal position in the normal authority. She was a therapist, but actually she was the source of this handicapped school, and people always came to her, always looked to her. She was giving the whole thing direction, and she didn't until she came to look at this. She didn't even recognize what the role she was playing. She felt it, and when she came to my source day, where I had a group of different leaders, she said, "I don't know who the source is in our school." And I said, "Well, I think it's you. Couldn't it be you?" And she burst into tears and said, "Yes, I think it's me." And from that point on, we looked, well, how does she's just an ordinary therapist in the formal structure. She can't just go back into the structure and say, "Hey, everybody, I'm source." So how do we actually organize step by step that she can take her place, get recognized in that whole structure? And it was a process of 2 or 3 years where some people didn't like it and they left and needed to leave, and others got it straight off and were really supportive and kind of helped to carry her in her proper role. And it was a strong cultural shift that took place over a period of time. So that's the reality of it. I don't suggest that it's a sort of instant panacea, but it's a process of the sort that you are in and dealing with every day, Francesca, I think, with these organizations. And you're very skillful.
Yeah, it's interesting because it just reminds me of a discussion we often have in Greater Than, because we're trying to connect personal development with the organizational development, because it seems like it's hard to do one without the other.
Can't, yeah.
But if I think about your money work, which is, a very profound experience, and I think about, everyone in the world and how many people are actually, for so many different reasons, right, in terms of time, finances, capacity, etc., like actually able to do that, it just, I find that really challenging. Like, can we expect everyone to do money work and then, okay, then we figured it out? Or is it something about how many people have done that and we're just sort of increasing the numbers? Or how do you think that could spread?
It's spreading step by step. You can imagine I started this 30 years ago, and it's still at the beginning. It needs patience. And quite a lot of patience. And when you say everybody, well, you'll probably have my white hair by the time everybody, or you may be under the earth like me by the time everybody. I don't have that ambition. But if I look over the 37 years that I've been working on this and the last 12 years on Source, I can see the evolution and the development. And I have a different relation to scaling up, as is usually talked about. Actually, I like to scale up more, as much horizontally. The horizontal comes when the vertical has been done enough. So I've been, recognizing that the scale up needs to scale down. It needs to get roots, proper roots first. For something to grow, you need to have proper roots. So I scale down. I've been scaling down for many, many years first. And to be able to carry the energy when the thing comes out through the earth and starts to scale up. Otherwise it would get knocked over, particularly with the sort of energetic processes that we're dealing with the money work and the source work, and that you are actually carrying now. So I have every conviction that this goes out and is continuing to go out, and I see things growing on an exponential curve, but like nature up to a certain point, and then there's a ceiling, not forever. There's a ceiling. So that's how I see this. It's still this work is still at the early part of the curve, but I sense it's growing. And if I look at the demands I'm getting now, it's definitely growing. And just being here with you today.
You can see there's a lot of interest in the topic.
I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, it would not have been possible almost.
So there's a lot of really great questions coming through in the chat. So I think I'm gonna pick a few of those, and then you can keep posting questions in the chat if you like. I think that's probably the easiest. So Brian Stout is asking about asking you to expand a bit more on succession of a collective and why it's not possible. Maybe I'll just read out what it says, because there's a little bit of a text. It feels to me like the primary barrier in movement and teal spaces is the succession, where people can easily grasp the power of source, but struggle with how to then transition to full co-creation, which is, of course, our shared aspiration. And if you want to add anything, Brian, you're also welcome to, and otherwise Peter will jump in to respond.
Yeah. So he's not jumping in, but I'd love to see him. So if something is not working, in other words, if there is not what you're calling co-creation, in other words, people are not fully in their creative power, then my analysis is that there's something with the source. So we always go back as far as we can to this, what I'm calling the source person, the founder. So the succession, if the founder is ready for a succession, they need to find somebody to hand it over to. And the person that they want to hand it over to needs to want to take it and take the full responsibility 100% for it. And the co-creation is not done. It's an illusion, as far as I'm concerned, to think the co-creation is done by the source handing it over to a number of people who are active at the moment. That's not, as far as I'm concerned, a succession. I don't know if I've answered this well, but I'm trying to feel into the question. If Brian, if you want to say something more and I haven't quite understood the question, please.
I guess I think I agree, and I think the question that I've seen folks, myself included, wrestle with is how, if our aspiration is to be a co-creative collective, which I think many of us in this space, that is probably the goal. I sort of don't like or disagree with the notion that it has to be handed from person to person, like a one-to-one handoff. I think we're trying to find a way to hand off from source, which people can get, to a collective, which is the aspiration, while still having the initial source be part of the collective. And I hear you saying that's not possible, and I'm curious to understand why not.
Well, I consider that what I work with is a collective. So I'm very clearly the source of my initiative. And I take full responsibility. So if something happens, which can happen regularly, that in my field, which I'm not happy with, I look at myself, say, how did I create this? What happened here? That this is actually happening in my field. I come back to myself first and see, okay, there's something I need to develop here, or that will happen again, or it'll happen downstream. So that's the way the source needs to handle that. So as far as I'm concerned, and Fran is part of my initiative, my Congress, for example. As far as I'm concerned, she's been incredibly co-creative in my field and in my space with what she's doing. And she comes in, does her bit, totally in her power. When it's done, it's done. She goes out and can come back again. That's co-creation for me. So okay, you're shaking your head. So what's co-creation for you?
Yeah, I guess I think we're all trying to escape this sort of polarity of, on the one hand, the top down, and the other hand, kind of the green, everyone co-equal thing. And it seems to me like there is in the way you talk about and the way Tom writes about the source transition, that makes intuitive sense to me. And I think what I'm struggling with is why it has to be an individual succession rather than a collective succession.
It's just the way things work. It's like,
But does it have to be that way?
Well, I've invited, it's like, I've invited people over the 12 years to show me, if they don't like it, if they have some other idealistic view, to come and show me, give me evidence that it works. And when I see it working, I'm really interested because I may be wrong. So I invite you to bring it to me, produce the evidence, and I'll gladly look at the evidence. But for 12 years, I've been inviting people to come, with shared visions and collective visions, which I believe are also an illusion, and say, well, bring me your collective vision, and bring me, after 5 years, the whole group that created this collective vision, and show me that they're still present. And after 12 years, I haven't had one group of what I call idealists that have come to me with that evidence. So until I have the evidence, I have lots of evidence to show how it works, a succession works from one hand to one hand. I have lots of evidence.
A bunch of more questions. I'm
Okay.
really sorry to cut you off.
Okay.
But I'd love to pick up a few more of these questions. And I think one of them is actually related to what you were just talking about, which is that there's quite a few questions here about, like, what does it actually look like to take responsibility for the field that you're the source of? Like, what does that mean? And because there's a question also around, is this like being in a steady state of living as a channel?
Well, you know, nobody's perfect. So one of the source, if you like, principles almost, is that the chronic state of a good source or a source person, a founder, if you like, is doubt. So what I say, and there's usually a lot of relief around this, 80% of the time, if you've created a project, you're likely to be in doubt. You don't really know what to do next. But the point is that when you've done all the work on yourself and you've been in this questioning state and been looking for the answer for what next, when you figure out what's next, then there's no doubt. And you know, and you also know that you know. And that's another of the realities. If you look at strong sources, they're kind of acting in that kind of way. When they know, there's no question around it, and you can feel it energetically. They will say, we will go left, and everybody, you will want to follow them because you can feel the pull of that direction.
So I have actually a related question here that maybe I'd actually like to ask him also to briefly come and share. Julius Dreyer, because basically what he's saying is that what if source is not a person or something personal, but a skill or state of mind that basically sort of we're all plugged into sort of the source of intelligence, and that maybe a certain person's able to tune into that frequency, but that doesn't mean that it's just them.
Yeah.
I don't know, Julius, if you want to add anything to that, because I thought it's very insightful. And then jump in if he's still here.
Well, I gladly respond to that.
Yeah.
In my source, oh, hi, Julius. Do you want to add anything? No. So I gladly respond to that. So, so in my source work, what I call my body of work, I make the word source, I call the word source as a person, and I make that interchangeable with the founder. So, you know, it's very important to define your terms with this, because the source can be defined in all sorts of ways. And some people talk about source energy, or some people talk about inner source, and you're talking about what other people might call the universal field of source. And I would agree with you, and other people might say, well, it's your little voice inside, it's an inner source, and meaning the same thing. And I agree with you that what I call the source person, or the source, or the founder, when they're tuned in, they're getting information from some kind of channel. And it doesn't matter whether they believe in spirituality or they're running a gas station, a petrol station. I've had people in my work having those kind of businesses too. Everybody will agree they're getting information from somewhere. and it comes to the source, it comes gushing in. And that's part of the work. You have to sort out all these ideas that come in all the time, you know, to figure out, well, what's next? Where do I go next? And that's why being a founder or a source is, I say, it's a full-time job, just to sort all of that out from, if you like to call source, the source energy, all these ideas that are coming in, to figure out what next. So I think, you know, we're talking about the same things, but, you know, using the precision of language is very important, so there's not confusion. So that would be my answer here.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So I have one question for the end, so I'm going to do one before that, which is, the classic one about source and personal relationships, which we're quite familiar with, that people are interested in. But so let's keep that for the end, because that sort of takes us off in another direction. But before that, so someone here was talking about how source principles and the importance of order may relate to Christopher Alexander's Nature of Order. About creating living, breathing, meaningful collaborative work. Just curious, are you familiar with this? Are there connections that you have made around that?
I don't know his work in any depth, but I do remember reading some things, and I really liked what I read. That's as much as I remember. So I guess the answer is yes, there is some kind of relationship there.
So I'm curious if the person who shared that, if they would like to jump in and share a few words on that, if you're still here.
Yeah, I'm still here, Francesca. So the whole point about Alexander uses a concept of centers, which relate to buildings and there being centers. That's and right. Strong centers and then weak centers. And in some respect, it seems like you could look at subsources as being weak centers. The center gets started by the source or sourcerer or whatever, and then you're using this process of sourcing to keep connected, and all. But the important part I feel in Alexander's work is that it's the relationships between everything that really matter and how you sustain this living organization, and more attention could be placed on that, I think, with as an extension of what your work is on source principles, and then it could have, maybe make this whole subsource thing a little less of an issue. And that's my point. Thanks, Francesca.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before we jump to the relationship question, I am very curious about this question from Ilan. Does source honor democracy? Or basically trying to think about how in our democracy is that being portrayed?
As far as I'm concerned, source, when it's manifested, is total democracy. And what's being called democratic at the moment, in terms of voting and so forth, the things that we see in politics, this is not democracy being lived at all. But the source work, when it's really alive, is totally democratic, because everybody has the potential to have their say. And actually, one of the source principles is that everybody can call everybody else. So for example, people in my field, the organizing principle is clarity. So if I'm not clear and I'm trying to take a decision, I can be called on it by anybody in my field, and I want to be, because I don't want to take any decision when I'm not clear. But at the same time, I can call on any subsource, and any subsource can call on anybody else. We have total equality there and total democracy. And, as I say, I want everybody to be fully in their power. So I want people to be in their power. I don't want to be an emperor without clothes. I want people to call me if I'm not clear. And, I can usually feel if I'm not clear, and I go out and ask people if I'm not clear. But there may be some things that I'm not seeing. There are always things that I'm not seeing. And I'm really, really grateful that people will come to me and call me upon them and push me if it's necessary and challenge me, like you're doing a bit here, Francesca, about around subsources. I love it. Because this is how we all, what we need to do to evolve together. And I still think I'm right at the moment, but can we keep challenging?
We're going to keep working on it.
Yeah.
So
I mean, Joshua in Spiral, of course, that was an enormous challenge, but it was a mutual one. Because I think I was equally challenging with him, and he acknowledged that at the end of our session.
So I know that we're almost coming up to the top of the hour. So for those
Yeah.
that have to drop off, I just wanted to say I put some resources in the chat because there's also a really great podcast from my colleague Lisa Gill, and also a video from Peter from We Share Fest recently, where he talks a lot about these subjects. And I also wanted to just invite you to the money games that Greater Than is running, which there's also a link for in the chat, which is also a really interesting experience that connects with everything we're talking about. And so I think maybe let's close on this question of relationships, because we're going to stay on a few minutes longer if people want to hang in, and we have the recording if you want to look later on, because this really is a question that often comes up and is always very interesting to explore. It seems like there's actually many people in Peter Koenig's community that are like really practicing in this area. So the question was basically, how do source principles play out in relationships, families, or communities, and whether there's a source for relationships or partnerships?
Well, thank you for the question. You know, I started the source work totally focused on business, and this question kept coming up and coming up and coming up in the groups that I was doing the research work with. People seem to be some of these business leaders seem to be more concerned about their personal relationships than what was running in their company and their partnership. And so I started responding using source principles in couple relationships and saying, well, you know, if there is a source of a relationship, this is the person that would take the first risk in the relationship to become a couple would be the source. And that person would know best what's best for the relationship. And I said, but this is just a light hypothesis. This is how it would be if these principles apply to the couple. And what's happened over the years, because this is, you know, I don't determine, sort of affirm anything lightly. I say I will really need to have lots of evidence that this is useful before I'm going to be stronger on it. And lots of evidence started coming back from people who I shared this with, that this was really useful. And so now, you know, anybody looking here, if you want to look at what's happening in your relationship, this, you know, I would invite you to do this, because it seems to be quite a useful thing to do, to see who is the source of the relationship. And maybe there are things that you are trying to do in your relationship, but you're not the source, but you think you have a responsibility for something that you don't actually have. And you can just relax. And that's, for example, I'm not the source of my partnership, for example. Barbara, my partner, is the source of our relationship. She took the first risk to get me into the relationship. And knowing that, I don't try and take any joint decisions, because I know when she decides something for us, I can feel whether she's clear or not. And when she's clear, it's so obvious to me to do what she wants. There's no resistance. And if she's not clear, I can feel that too. I can challenge what she's suggesting. There's no difficulty around that either. So yes, it applies. It does. We have sufficient evidence now to be able to see it's very likely that it applies in relationships and can be very useful. And just a further thing, which is still controversial, and there's still more research that needs to come in, but some of my practitioners are absolutely convinced now that it applies to children, and it can be very useful in families, looking at who the source is of each individual child. So, you know, the mother may be the source of one child or all the children, but the father may be the source of the second one. And the reason it can be useful is that parent usually knows what's best for that particular child. That's the evidence that's coming back. And we've gone so far as to have mediation, and there's some mediators in families now that are using these principles to very good and very touching effect, actually. So there's lots of more research to be done on this, but it does seem to hold. It's radical, it's revolutionary, but it seems to hold a certain potential. So I invite everybody who feels like doing it to just try that on for size. Just put those spectacles on and see how it might affect you and your families.
It's definitely a great provocation. Lots to think on. And yeah, I think that we're gonna sort of wrap up the formal part here. We'll hang on for a few more questions. But thank you so much for this conversation, Peter. I'm really looking forward to continuing the debate and seeing what new ideas and evolutions we can come up with, because I'm definitely, quite determined to see how we can find some tweaks and new adaptations to work in my context. And
Absolutely.
I really appreciate all the comments. We're going to share the chat with everybody because there's been some really rich things coming through there. And yeah, any final words, Peter, that you'd like to share?
I'd just like to express my gratitude, Fran, for setting this up and running it so beautifully, and your brilliant and beautiful competence with this. And thank everybody for taking part and being so interested in this subject. I think there's enormous potential in this work and in this subject in terms of answering some of the big questions that we are facing, both politically and economically right now, and of course in terms of our organizational evolution. And so I'm so happy to see that there is genuine interest, and invite everybody to experiment, and particularly coming back to doing what you love. Make sure that you're the source, that you are the source, and loving what you're doing and doing what you love, that you're being called from this bigger source or universe to realize something here, and to get in touch with that and just do it. That would be my